first instinct when having conversations about race in the Shakespeare classroom might be to focus on characters of color or explicitly othered characters like Othello, Caliban, or Shylock. But it is crucial to scrutinize whiteness when exploring early modern constructions of social difference with students. Often students find it easier to identify racialization in these explicitly othered characters, but are unable to see that characters like Hamlet or Desdemona are also navigating their own racial identities. Students are not often taught to see issues of white privilege and power or to think about what whiteness means within early modern literature. The resistance to scrutinizing their own whiteness can be particularly complicated with feminist students who often are encouraged to mobilize around being individuals defined primarily by gender but not by race. For some of them, whiteness seems to be devoid of meaning. In order to have the conversations we need to have about race in my classroom, we first acknowledge that whiteness is not an empty or invisible signifier, but is a racial identity loaded with national, political, and economic concerns, in particular, the concerns of an emerging British Empire. As a Black woman, I don't bond with my students over mutual confusion, guilt, or shame in whiteness, nor can I find for them a positive value in whiteness. White students must nonetheless come to terms with what the history of whiteness means, even if it's uncomfortable. In my classes, I facilitate these explorations by asking students to consider the way beauty as a visual schema has economic, political, social, and religious effects. These conversations can help students start to see the yoking together of whiteness, normativity, and privilege, and to see race as a concept that has many different configurations. An examination of the concept of beauty, for example, often leads naturally to discussions of race in early modern literary works. One way to introduce these conversations in the classroom is to consider representations of Queen Elizabeth I and to discuss how her whiteness becomes both a spiritual and racialized virtue specifically associated with England. Christianity has long provided the Western world with a symbolic order in which good, purity, and Christianity itself are associated with light and whiteness, while evil, sexuality, and difference are linked with darkness and blackness. In the early modern period, these religious tropes become re-energized by a European world growing increasingly exposed to darker others. There is a heightened anxiety about maintaining a racial and national identity independent from such peoples in order to maintain a ruling order based on racial hierarchies. One of the most visually striking examples of this emerges in the portrait of the Armada, where whiteness coalesces with the projection of national solidarity and superiority. The Armada portrait also represents whiteness as a specific attribute of Englishness when it depicts England's triumph over Spain within the larger cosmology of good over evil. Queen Elizabeth I visually comes to represent all of England and all of whiteness. When the very common concept of fairness is part of a nationalist fervor, it foregrounds whiteness in the drive for superiority. But this superiority becomes most visible when juxtaposed to blackness. We see this at play in early modern literary works such as The Tragedy of Miriam, Othello, and Orinoco. Take, for example, Othello, where virtue is an integral component of fairness or whiteness. In the aftermath of Othello explaining how he and Desdemona fell in love, the play suggests his virtue is seen in spite of his blackness. The Duke thinks that Othello is able to overcome his negatively connoted blackness when he says to Brabantio, "If virtue no delighted beauty lack, your son-in-law is far more fair than black." What then is seen as the most important factor of fairness? Whiteness is inherent to fairness, but Black characters can achieve or earn fairness by demonstrating honor or virtue. It is vital to recognize that the play attempts to imagine Othello in that moment as transcending his Blackness via his virtue, while simultaneously showing that beauty itself is firmly tethered to whiteness. He is not beautiful in their eyes, and yet he is deserving of being seen as fair. In this way, whiteness is rendered central and superior to everything else, and in this way, structures of white supremacy take hold. In our classrooms, we need to encourage students to see the work of whiteness so as to make the racism behind these ideas visible too.